You think you know silence. But when you're an Omega sharing a one-way telepathic link with your alpha twin brother, silence simply doesn't exist. Declan spends his days restoring antique furniture, hiding in the dust, pretending he can't hear the vicious, possessive growls echoing in his own skull. Augustus thinks he's an expert at hiding his wolf's obsession behind tailored suits and CEO smiles. He's wrong. The real danger isn't the boardroom. It's what happens when Augustus's mind finally snaps, and Declan decides to stop fighting back. The migraine always started at the base of Declan's skull, a low, rhythmic thumping that mirrored a heartbeat that wasn't his. He set the sandpaper down on the workbench, wiping his palms on his heavy denim apron. Fine mahogany dust coated his forearms, settling into the faint, silvery scars left behind by suppressant patches. He hated the patches. They burned the skin. The pills were worse for the liver, leaving a persistent copper taste on his tongue, but they kept his scent dull, muted, practically non-existent. To the rest of the world, Declan was just a beta craftsman, the quiet, unambitious twin brother of the city's most ruthless real estate magnate. Stupid, incompetent, I'll ruin him. The thought wasn't a sound, it was a pressure. It crashed into the front of Declan's mind, sharp and cold, carrying the distinct mental signature of his brother. Declan closed his eyes and leaned his weight against the heavy oak table. It was 2 p.m. Augustus was in the glass-walled boardroom 40 floors above the workshop, likely tearing into the legal team again, tear out his throat. The secondary thought followed, deeper, rougher, the pure, unfiltered voice of Augustus's alpha. Declan massaged his temples. The telepathic link was a genetic fluke, a twisted byproduct of their identical DNA splitting in the womb, further warped when they presented at 18. Augustus, the dominant alpha. Declan, the recessive omega. The textbook said twin bonds were empathetic. They never mentioned living with a live feed of your brother's most primal, violent instincts. The bell above the workshop door jingled. Declan didn't need to look up. The headache abruptly shifted from a sharp, stabbing pain to a heavy, suffocating blanket of possessive warmth. Augustus stepped into the shop. The contrast between them was always jarring to outsiders. They shared the same sharp jawline, the same dark, heavy-lidded eyes, and the same tall frame. But where Declan was rough edges, sawdust, and rolled-up sleeves, Augustus was precision. His charcoal suit didn't have a single crease. His shoes gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights of the shop. He looked like exactly what he was, an untouchable CEO. "You're not answering your phone," Augustus said. His voice was smooth, cultured, perfectly modulated. Blood on his knuckles, bruises. Why does he insist on working with his hands? Need to wrap him in silk, lock the door, keep him. Declan swallowed hard, forcing his face to remain impassive. It took every ounce of his willpower not to flinch at the raw, obsessive intensity roaring in his head. He reached for a rag and wiped his hands. "I had the machinery running. Couldn't hear it. What do you want, Augustus?" Augustus walked deeper into the shop, stepping carefully over a coil of extension cords. He hated the shop. Declan knew this not just from the slight curl of Augustus's lip, but from the distinct wave of revulsion echoing through the bond. The smell of varnish and wood glue offended Augustus's heightened senses, mostly because it masked Declan's natural scent. "Mother expects us for dinner on Sunday," Augustus said, stopping a few feet away. He slipped his hands into his pockets. "I told her I would drive you. I have my own truck. Your truck is an eyesore, and the engine sounds like it's dying. I'll pick you up at 6. Mine to transport, Mine to protect. No one looks at him in my car. Tinted windows. Declan's jaw tightened. He tossed the dirty rag onto the workbench. Fine. 6. Was there anything else? I have a client coming to pick up this credenza in an hour. Augustus didn't leave. He stood there, his dark eyes scanning Declan's face. To anyone else, the CEO looked mildly bored. But in the quiet of Declan's mind, the Alpha's presence was pacing like a caged animal. Too pale. He's taking the pills again. Poison. I should throw them out. I should pin him to that table and bite the sick out of his blood. Let me scent him. Let me claim. A cold sweat broke out across the back of Declan's neck. The urges had been getting worse. For years, Augustus's inner wolf had been a background hum of protective instinct. But recently, over the last few months, it had mutated into something dark, hungry, and entirely inappropriate for a sibling. Augustus didn't know Declan could hear him. If Augustus knew the sick, twisted fantasies leaking through the bond, the Alpha's legendary control would shatter entirely. You look tired, Dec, Augustus said quietly. The spoken words were gentle, almost brotherly. I'm fine, just working hard. Augustus took a half-step forward. The air between them grew thick. Declan's omega instincts, usually battered into submission by the chemical blockers, gave a pathetic, involuntary flutter at the proximity of his twin's overwhelming power. One step closer, just touch his neck, feel the pulse, smell the sweet underneath the chemicals. Please. 6 o'clock, Declan said sharply, taking a deliberate step back. He grabbed a chisel, needing to put an object between them. Don't be late. Augustus paused. The physical rejection hit the bond like a stone dropped in water. A flare of hurt, immediately swallowed by a dark, possessive anger. I'm never late, Augustus murmured. He turned on his heel and walked out, the little bell chiming cheerfully behind him. Declan dropped the chisel. His hands were shaking so badly it clattered against the wood. He braced himself over the sink in the corner, turning on the cold water and splashing it over his face. He looked at his reflection in the cheap, cracked mirror. Identical to Augustus, yet entirely consumed by the invisible cage his brother had built around him. He couldn't keep doing this. The suppressants were losing their efficacy against the sheer proximity of Augustus's intent. Sooner or later, the dam in Augustus's mind was going to break, and the wolf was going to take the wheel. The Founders' Gala was an annual exercise in corporate endurance. Held in the grand ballroom of the city's oldest hotel, it was a sea of crystal chandeliers, aggressive networking, and the suffocating intermingling of high society alpha pheromones. Declan stood near the heavy velvet drapes at the edge of the room, nursing a glass of sparkling water that had long gone flat. His tuxedo was tailored, a gift forced upon him by Augustus, and it felt like a straitjacket. He had taken a double dose of suppressants before arriving. His joints ached with a dull, throbbing cold, and his mouth tasted entirely of copper. But he needed the armor. The ballroom was packed with the city's elite, and Augustus was in his element, holding court near the center of the room. Through the psychic link, Declan's head was a roaring auditorium of Augustus's calculations. Reynolds is lying about the quarterly margins. Ignore him. Smile. Shake his hand. Where is Declan? There, by the curtain. He looks cornered. Why is he standing so far away? Move closer. Keep him in sight. Declan shifted his weight, turning his shoulder to break the line of sight. It didn't help. The psychic tether just pulled tighter. Every time Augustus shook a hand or laughed at a joke, a secondary layer of thought tracked Declan's exact coordinates in the room. It was exhausting. Hiding in the shadows, Declan? Declan blinked, pulling his focus away from the noise in his head. A man was standing beside him, holding a scotch. Colin. He was the heir to a logistics company and an alpha whose scent always reminded Declan of burnt plastic and cheap cologne. Colin had always harboured a bitter rivalry with Augustus, a rivalry that often manifested in attempts to needle Declan. "Just enjoying the quiet," Declan said evenly, gripping his glass. "Hard to do with your brother sucking all the air out of the room." Colin smirked, stepping closer. He leaned against the wall, invading Declan's personal space. Colin inhaled subtly. "You're heavily blocked tonight. Can't smell a thing. Augustus still got you on a tight leash?" Declan's stomach plummeted. He didn't have time to answer. Across the room, the psychic link erupted into pure, white-hot static. Threat. Close. Touching his space. Teeth. Rip his throat out. Break his spine. Declan flinched, his hand flying to his temple as a spike of agonizing pain drove through his skull. Augustus's mental voice wasn't just loud, it was deafening. Colin frowned, taking Declan's wince for weakness. He reached out, his hand wrapping around Declan's bicep. "Hey, you all right? You look like you're going to pass out. Let me get you out of here." Hands off. Mine. The sheer force of the alpha command echoing in the bond made Declan's knees buckle. His grip on the glass failed. It slipped from his fingers, shattering on the polished marble floor with a sharp crash that cut through the low hum of the gala. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Declan was gasping for air, the double dose of suppressants warring with the massive surge of adrenaline. Because of the shock, his chemical barrier fractured. Just for a fraction of a second, a slip of his true scent, warm honey, crushed pine needles, and pure distressed omega, leaked into the air. Colin's eyes dilated instantly. The smug rival dropped his glass, his alpha instincts seizing on the sudden, intoxicating smell of a vulnerable omega. "Declan," he breathed, his grip on Declan's arm tightening. But before Colin could pull him closer, a hand clamped down on Colin's shoulder. It was Augustus. Declan hadn't even seen him move. 1 second Augustus was 30 feet away, and the next, he was there, a towering wall of tailored fury. Augustus's physical scent was suddenly suffocating. Ozone, dark thunderheads, and lethal aggression. "Let go of my brother," Augustus said. His voice was barely a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a physical blow. Colin froze, his instincts warring between the omega in front of him and the apex predator standing beside him. Slowly he released Declan's arm, taking a step back, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Just helping him, Augustus." He dropped his drink. Augustus didn't look at Colin. His dark, burning eyes were locked onto Declan. Bruise on his arm. Colin's scent on his jacket. Kill him. Tear him apart. Mine. 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 "We're leaving," Augustus said aloud. He didn't wait for a response. Augustus's hand shot out, wrapping securely around the back of Declan's neck. The moment skin made contact with skin, the psychic link short-circuited. Declan gasped. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a flood of raw emotion. Pure, unadulterated obsession, desperation, a possessive hunger so deep it felt like falling down a bottomless well. Augustus's grip was firm, guiding or dragging Declan through the crowd. The sea of wealthy executives parted for them instantly, stepping back from the suffocating pressure of Augustus's leaking alpha aura. Declan stumbled, his vision blurring. "Augustus, stop!" he hissed under his breath, trying to pry his brother's fingers off his neck. "People are staring." "Let them stare. Let them know. If one of them looks at him again, I'll blind them." Augustus pushed through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom, ignoring the valets, bypassing the lobby entirely. He shoved open the door to the private elevator reserved for the hotel's penthouse suites, rooms their company owned. He pushed Declan inside and slammed his palm against the button for the top floor. The doors slid shut, cutting off the noise of the gala, trapping them in a small, mirrored box. The silence was heavy, broken only by the hum of the elevator cables and Declan's ragged breathing. Augustus stood in front of the doors, his back to Declan. His fists were clenched at his sides. The muscles in his broad shoulders were rigid, trembling slightly with the effort of holding his wolf back. In Declan's head, the noise was chaotic. It was a loop of violence and desperation. Scent fading. He took too many pills. I need to get them out of him. I need to smell him. I need to bury my teeth in his gland and make him stay. "You're suffocating me," Declan managed to choke out, leaning against the mirrored wall. Augustus turned slowly. The civilized mask was gone. His eyes were entirely blown out, the pupils swallowing the dark irises. "I am trying," Augustus rasped, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, inhuman register, "to keep you safe." The elevator chimed, a cheerful sound that felt obscenely out of place. The doors opened directly into the penthouse. It was a massive, sterile space of floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking the glittering city, black leather and polished chrome. Augustus grabbed Declan's wrist and pulled him inside, striding across the room to the heavy mahogany bar. He dropped Declan's arm as if burned and grabbed a crystal decanter. The glass clinked frantically against a tumbler as Augustus poured 2 fingers of amber liquid. He downed it in a single swallow, his back to the room. Declan rubbed his wrist, staying near the center of the living area. The suppressant crash was hitting him hard now. His temperature was spiking, and a deep, instinctual tremor was working its way through his legs. Look at him, standing so far away, always running, always building walls. I could cross the room before he takes a breath. I could put him on the floor. Declan squeezed his eyes shut, pressing the heels of his hands against his temples. "Stop," he whispered. Augustus froze at the bar. He poured another glass, slower this time. "Stop what? I haven't said a word, Declan." "You're pacing," Declan lied, trying to cover his slip. "You're stressing me out." "It was just a dropped glass, Augustus. Colin was just being an idiot." Augustus turned around. The tumbler in his hand looked fragile against his tight grip. "He was touching you. He smelled you. Your blockers failed. Why did they fail? Did he want Colin to notice?" "No, no. He hates Colin. He is mine. I share blood with him. I share a face. I won't share him." Declan swayed on his feet. The migraine was splitting his head down the middle. He couldn't do the dance anymore. He couldn't play the oblivious little brother while standing in the blast radius of Augustus's obsessive internal monologue. "They failed because I took too many," Declan said, his voice cracking. He looked up, meeting Augustus's dark, feral gaze. "Because every time I'm in a room with you, your pheromones are so violently suffocating, I feel like I'm drowning." Augustus's eyes narrowed. He set the glass down. The precise, calculated movements of the CEO were returning, but it was a brittle veneer. "I don't release pheromones around you. I have perfect control. Control. I have control. I don't look. I don't touch. I just watch. I protect." "You don't have control, Augustus," Declan shouted, the exhaustion finally breaking his temper. "You think you're hiding it, but you're not." Augustus stepped away from the bar. The air in the penthouse instantly grew heavier. It wasn't just a metaphor. Declan's lungs actually struggled to pull in oxygen. Augustus walked slowly, deliberately, until he was standing just inches from Declan. Declan had to tilt his head up to maintain eye contact. Up close, he could see a faint bead of sweat on Augustus's temple. "Explain," Augustus commanded softly. "He knows. What does he know? Did I look too long? Did I slip? Pin him down. Make him tell me." The intrusive thought was so loud, so violently clear, that Declan physically flinched backward. His heel caught the edge of the thick rug, and he stumbled. Augustus caught him instantly. Both hands clamped around Declan's waist, pulling him flush against a chest that felt like solid rock. The heat radiating off the alpha was immense. The physical contact was a mistake. The psychic barrier between them, already strained to the breaking point, collapsed entirely. Declan didn't just hear the thoughts, he felt them. He felt the phantom sensation of Augustus's teeth brushing against the scent gland on his neck. He felt the terrifying, agonizing depth of Augustus's loneliness, a gaping black hole that only Declan could fill. He felt the primal imperative demanding Augustus mate with his own twin. Logic and biology be damned. Declan gasped, grabbing Augustus's lapels not to push him away, but to keep himself upright under the mental onslaught. "Stop!" Declan sobbed, tears of sheer neurological overload spilling over his lashes. "Augustus, stop thinking about it." Augustus's hands went rigid on Declan's waist. His breathing stopped. "I'm not a bone you can bury in the backyard," Declan choked out, his fingers twisting in the expensive fabric of Augustus's suit. He stared up into his brother's horrified face. "Stop thinking about biting me. Stop thinking about pinning me down. I hear it, Augustus. I hear every single word." Dead silence. For the first time in 10 years, the voice in Declan's head vanished. The absolute absence of Augustus's internal monologue was more terrifying than the noise. Augustus stared down at him. The alpha's face had drained of all color, turning an ashen, sickly white. His hands, still gripping Declan's waist, began to tremble violently. "You!" Augustus whispered, his voice completely hollow. "You can hear me?" Declan gave a miserable nod, a tear tracking through the dust on his cheek. "Since we were 18, every word." Augustus didn't pull away. Instead, a terrifying shift occurred in his eyes. The horror faded, replaced by something much darker. The realization that he didn't have to hide anymore. The realization that the cage door was already open. "You heard everything." The thought slid into Declan's mind, smooth and chillingly calm. "Then you know I'm never letting you leave this room." The silence in the penthouse stretched, thick and suffocating. Declan stared at his twin, his chest heaving, as the reality of what he had just confessed, and what Augustus had realized, settled over them like a shroud. For 10 years, the one-way mirror in Augustus's mind had been Declan's only defense. Augustus had built his entire persona around being the composed, untouchable alpha. He had sublimated his darkest, most possessive urges into an internal monologue he believed was private. Now that the mirror was shattered, there was no reason for Augustus to hold back. Augustus took a slow, deliberate step back, finally breaking physical contact. But the mental pressure didn't lift. It intensified. No more pills. No more hiding in that dusty basement. You belong here. The thought wasn't a fractured leak of instinct anymore. It was a direct, targeted broadcast. Augustus was testing the connection, sending the words with surgical precision straight into Declan's cerebral cortex. It felt like a cold needle slipping behind Declan's eyes. Declan pressed the heels of his hands against his temples, stumbling backward until his spine hit the heavy oak of the bar. "Get out of my head," he breathed, his voice trembling. "I don't think I will," Augustus said aloud. He walked past Declan to the massive digital control panel mounted on the wall. He pressed a sequence of buttons. A heavy mechanical clunk echoed through the penthouse as the private elevator locked. A secondary sequence dropped the reinforced steel security shades over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into a dim, artificial twilight. Safe. Secure. Mine. "You can't lock me in here," Declan said, his voice rising in a desperate attempt to drown out the voice in his skull. He lunged for the panel, but his legs were practically useless. The adrenaline spike from the gala was crashing, and the double dose of suppressants was waging a toxic war against his liver. His knees buckled. Augustus caught him before he hit the floor. The Alpha didn't just support his weight. He hauled Declan up against his chest, lifting him off his feet. Declan thrashed, throwing a wild punch that grazed Augustus's jaw. "Let me go! Augustus, let me go!" Augustus didn't flinch. He tightened his grip, wrapping one massive arm around Declan's waist and burying his other hand in Declan's hair, forcing his head down against Augustus's neck. "Stop fighting me, Dec. You're making yourself sick." Look at him shake. He's destroying his own body to stay away from me. I'll bleed the poison out of him myself if I have to. "I'm sick because of you," Declan yelled, his voice muffled against Augustus's collar. He pushed weakly at the broad shoulders. The physical scent of Augustus, ozone, crushed granite, and a terrifyingly pure alpha dominance was rolling off him in waves. Augustus was doing it on purpose. He was weaponizing his pheromones, flooding the room to force Declan's omega biology into submission. It was working. Declan's struggles lost their frantic edge, his muscles turning heavy and uncoordinated. The chemical blockers in his bloodstream were no match for the sheer proximity of a dominant twin. Augustus carried him effortlessly through the sprawling living room and down the wide hallway to the primary bedroom. He kicked the door open and dropped Declan onto the massive, king-sized bed. The mattress was incredibly soft, swallowing Declan as he scrambled frantically backward against the headboard. Augustus stood at the foot of the bed, perfectly still. He reached up and slowly unknotted his silk tie, pulling it from his collar and dropping it onto a leather chair. He unbuttoned the first 2 buttons of his shirt. "I should tie him to the bedpost. Keep him still. Stop him from running." Declan let out a choked, terrified sob, curling his knees to his chest. "Augustus, please. Please. You're my brother. You're my brother." Augustus's hands stopped on the 3rd button. His jaw tightened so hard, a muscle jumped in his cheek. The reminder of their blood tied a temporary knot in the Alpha's feral logic. Augustus closed his eyes, taking a deep, shuddering breath. When he opened them, the blown-out black pupils had receded just a fraction. "I know what I am," Augustus said softly, his voice rasping. "And I know what you are. The pills are killing you, Declan. Your liver enzymes were elevated at your last physical. I saw the lab reports. You hacked my medical records?" Declan stared at him, horrified. "I own the clinic. I own the doctors. I need to know everything." "I monitor my investments," Augustus replied smoothly, though the psychic broadcast betrayed the obsessive truth. He walked to the adjoining bathroom, turning on the faucet. He returned a moment later with a damp, warm towel and a glass of water. He sat on the edge of the bed. Declan immediately pressed himself harder against the headboard, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Drink," Augustus commanded, holding out the glass. Declan shook his head. A flash of sharp irritation spiked through the bond. Stubborn, disobedient. He needs hydration. The suppressants cause massive cellular dehydration during the crash phase. Force it down his throat if he won't take it. Declan flinched, snatching the glass from Augustus's hand before the Alpha could move. His hands shook so violently, water sloshed over his knuckles, soaking the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He drained the glass, his throat burning. Augustus took the empty glass and set it on the nightstand. Then, with terrifying gentleness, he reached out with the warm towel and began wiping the cold sweat from Declan's face. Declan squeezed his eyes shut, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of the intimacy. He hated the way his body responded to the care. His omega instincts, starved and battered by years of chemical suppression, purred at the gentle touch of a dominant alpha providing comfort. It was a biological betrayal. "You're going to stay here," Augustus said quietly, wiping the damp hair from Declan's forehead. "You're going to sweat out the rest of those pills, and when your scent returns to normal, we are going to have a long conversation about how the rest of our lives are going to work." He will never leave. I will build him a workshop in the spare room, bring him wood, bring him tools. But the door stays locked. "You're insane," Declan whispered, tears leaking from his closed eyes. Augustus's hand paused. He leaned in, his lips hovering mere inches from Declan's ear. The heat of his breath made Declan shiver. "Maybe," Augustus murmured, "but I'm the only one who can hear you breathe in the dark, Declan. And now I know you hear me too. We're already entirely entangled. Don't fight gravity." The crash began at 3 a.m. Declan had endured suppressant withdrawal before. Usually it was a mild fever, aching joints and a lingering headache. But those were instances of missing a single pill. This time, his body was fighting a massive overdose of blockers, while simultaneously being saturated by the thickest, most aggressive alpha pheromones he had ever encountered. His biology tore itself apart, trying to reconcile the conflicting signals. Declan lay curled on his side in the center of Augustus's massive bed, shivering so violently his teeth clicked together. His skin felt like it was coated in crushed glass. Every breath was a struggle against the heavy, ozone-scented air of the room. Augustus hadn't left. He sat in the leather armchair in the corner of the room, illuminated only by the faint blue glow of the city lights bleeding through the edges of the blackout shades. He had stripped down to a plain undershirt and slacks, his jacket and tie discarded on the floor. He watched Declan with unblinking focus, fever spiking, heart rate 110. He smells like rotting copper and sour milk. The chemicals are fighting back. Declan groaned, twisting into the heavy down comforter. "Stop tracking my pulse," he rasped, his throat raw. "I'm not tracking it, I can hear it," Augustus replied flatly. "It's echoing in the room. And in my chest. If his heart stops, mine stops." Declan squeezed his eyes shut, wishing the migraine would just blind him completely. The fever was cooking his brain. He felt a profound, agonizing emptiness in the pit of his stomach, a biological void that demanded to be filled by the very thing causing his distress. His scent gland, located at the juncture of his neck and shoulder, throbbed with a dull, burning ache. For years, the suppressants had kept it dormant, shriveled and useless. Now, with the chemicals burning out of his system, the gland was frantically trying to clear the blockage. Declan let out a sharp cry as a muscle spasm seized his lower back. He arched off the mattress, his hands twisting into the sheets. Augustus was out of the chair and on the bed in a fraction of a second. His large hands pinned Declan's shoulders to the mattress, holding him steady through the violent cramp. "Breathe," Augustus ordered, his voice sharp with command. "Through your nose, out through your mouth." "He's hurting. I can't stop the hurt. I can only wait it out. Let me take the pain. Let me bite it out of him." "Don't!" Declan gasped, his eyes flying open to meet Augustus's intense stare. Don't touch my neck. Augustus, swear to God. Augustus's thumbs smoothed over the delicate collarbones, deliberately avoiding the swollen, angry red skin of the scent gland. I'm not going to bite you while you're sick, Declan. I'm not an animal. But I want to. God, I want to pierce the skin and flood his veins with my scent until he smells like nothing but me. The disparity between Augustus's spoken words and his internal monologue was making Declan dizzy. He couldn't differentiate between the Augustus who was his pragmatic brother and the Alpha who was a prisoner of his own genetics. It hurts, Declan whimpered, the fever stripping away his pride. He hated himself for the sound. It was weak. It was an omega sound. I know, Augustus soothed, shifting his weight. He climbed fully onto the bed, ignoring Declan's weak push against his chest. Augustus gathered Declan into his arms, pulling him flush against his chest. Declan's body betrayed him instantly. The shivering subsided as he absorbed the immense, furnace-like heat radiating from Augustus. His nose instinctively buried itself into the crook of Augustus's neck, seeking the source of the ozone and rain scent. It was a terrifying paradox. The source of his terror was the only thing providing relief. Augustus let out a low, rumbling growl deep in his chest. It wasn't a threat. It was a purr, a deep, resonant vibration of absolute satisfaction. He wrapped his arms around Declan, caging him completely. Mine, in my bed, smelling me, seeking me. He knows where he belongs. I hate you, Declan mumbled into Augustus's skin, his tears soaking into the Alpha's undershirt. You hate the situation, Augustus corrected gently, his hand stroking a slow, rhythmic pattern down Declan's spine. You could never hate me. We shared a womb, Declan. We share a mind. We are two halves of the same whole. The world just tried to convince you that you needed to be separate. He will realize it soon. When the poison is gone, he will see clearly. Declan was too exhausted to argue. The fever was dragging him under, pulling him into a dark, suffocating sleep. The last thing he felt before he lost consciousness was Augustus's lips pressing a firm, lingering kiss against his sweat-dampened forehead. Declan woke to the sound of rain lashing against glass. For a long moment, he didn't open his eyes. He lay perfectly still, taking inventory of his body. The agonizing joint pain was gone. The fever had broken, leaving him feeling hollowed out and weak, but lucid. The metallic taste of copper in his mouth had vanished entirely, replaced by a lingering, dry thirst. He opened his eyes. The room was empty. The digital clock on the nightstand read 2:15 p.m. He had slept for nearly 36 hours. He sat up slowly. The heavy comforter pooled around his waist. He was wearing one of Augustus's oversized t-shirts, his ruined tuxedo shirt nowhere to be seen. He didn't want to think about Augustus undressing him while he was unconscious. Declan inhaled. The room smelled of Augustus, yes, but beneath the heavy ozone, Declan caught another scent. It was warm, golden, and sweet, like crystallized honey and sun-baked pine needles. It was him. He touched his neck. The scent gland wasn't burning anymore. It felt sensitive, alive, pulsing with a steady rhythm. The suppressants were completely out of his system. He was, for the first time in 10 years, a fully presented, unsuppressed omega. The realization sent a spike of pure, unfiltered panic through his chest. He threw the covers off and swung his legs out of bed. His bare feet hit the cold, hardwood floor. He needed his clothes. He needed to find his phone. He needed to get out before Augustus came back. He took 2 steps towards the bedroom door. He's awake. He's moving. The thought hit Declan's mind. But it felt different. It wasn't the deafening roar of a megaphone. It was quieter, clearer, devoid of the static that usually accompanied Augustus's inner voice. With the chemical blockers gone, the psychic link had stabilized. It was no longer a fractured connection, it was a wide-open channel. The door handle turned. Declan froze. Augustus stepped into the room. He was wearing a fresh suit, perfectly tailored, lacking only the tie. He carried a tray holding a bowl of soup, a glass of water, and a small stack of paperwork. He stopped just inside the doorway, his dark eyes locking onto Declan. Augustus inhaled sharply. The tray in his hands trembled slightly. God! He smells incredible, perfect, sweet and distressed. I want to drown in it. The sheer volume of Augustus's lust crashed into Declan's mind, making his knees weak. But this time, Declan didn't just flinch and take it. This time, he was unsuppressed. His own biology was awake, and his own instincts were screaming for survival. Declan felt a sudden, massive surge of anger, a pure, white-hot fury at his brother for trapping him, for controlling him, for turning his own genetics into a prison. "Don't look at me like that." Declan didn't speak the words aloud. He just thought them, pushing all of his terror and rage upward, forcing it down the invisible tether connecting their minds. Augustus stopped dead. The tray slipped from his fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a deafening crash. The ceramic bowl shattered, sending hot broth splashing across Augustus's polished shoes and the edge of the expensive rug. Augustus didn't look at the mess. He stared at Declan, his eyes wide, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He raised a hand to his temple as if he had just been struck by a physical blow. Pain, ringing, his voice, "In my head." Declan stared at his hands, his breath hitching. He had never projected a thought back. He had never even tried. He always assumed the link was a receiver, not a transmitter. But the suppressants hadn't just been muting his scent. They had been acting as a psychic dampener. Augustus lowered his hand from his temple. The shock in his eyes was slowly being replaced by awe. He took a step forward, ignoring the shattered ceramic under his boots. "Do that again," Augustus whispered. Declan backed away, shaking his head. "Stay away from me, Augustus." "I mean it. If you come closer, I swear to God, I'll smash that window and jump." He projected the thought, pouring every ounce of his desperate, terrified conviction into the mental broadcast. Augustus halted instantly. A wave of profound, icy terror rushed back through the bond, originating from Augustus. "No, no, no. Don't hurt himself. Keep him safe. I have to keep him safe." "I won't move," Augustus said aloud, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I won't move, Declan. Just calm down." Declan leaned against the wall, breathing hard. The power dynamic in the room had suddenly, violently shifted. Augustus might be the physically dominant alpha, capable of locking doors and commanding respect with a single look. But Declan was the anchor. Declan's emotions, his pain, and his fear were now a direct, unfiltered weapon that could cripple Augustus's mind. "Unlock the elevator," Declan demanded, his voice steady despite the shaking in his limbs. Augustus's jaw set. The alpha instinct flared, a stubborn refusal to let his omega out of the den. "He belongs here. The outside is dangerous." Declan narrowed his eyes and pushed his anger harder into the bond, a sharp, blinding spike of resentment. "Unlock it, Augustus, or I'll make sure you never hear a moment of peace in your own head ever again." Augustus grimaced, rubbing his forehead. The standoff lasted for 10 excruciating seconds. The alpha's desire to possess warred violently with the unbearable psychic pain his twin was inflicting. Slowly, reluctantly, Augustus reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black remote. He pressed a button. A heavy, mechanical clunk echoed from the living room. The elevator was unlocked. "You can leave," Augustus said, his voice hollow. "But you can't run, Declan. You know that now. No matter where you go, I'm right there with you." Declan didn't reply. He stepped carefully around the shattered bowl of soup, keeping his eyes locked on his brother, and walked out into the living room. The cage door was open, but as Declan stepped into the elevator, he realized Augustus was right. You can't escape a cage when the bars are built into your own mind. The drive back to his apartment took 40 minutes. Declan drove his beat-up truck with the windows rolled down, letting the cold, damp city air whip through the cab. He needed the wind to scour Augustus's scent from his clothes, his hair, and his skin. He didn't turn the radio on. He didn't need to. Traffic on the bridge. He's taking the long way. Why is he taking the long way? The tread on his left front tire is worn. It's raining. He's going to skid. Declan tightened his grip on the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. "I'm fine," he said aloud to the empty cab. Then, focusing his intent, he pushed the thought back down the tether. "I'm fine. Stop hovering." A heavy, bruised silence echoed back. It wasn't an absence of thought, but a deliberate, white-knuckled restraint on Augustus's end. Declan parked in the alley behind his building, an aging brick triplex above a closed-down bakery. He climbed the rusted fire escape to his second-floor unit, his boots ringing hollow against the metal. When he unlocked his door and stepped inside, the apartment felt impossibly small. Without the chemical blockers in his system, his own senses were overwhelming. The apartment smelled like stale coffee, dust, and the sharp tang of the citrus cleaner he used on the floors. But beneath it all, curling around the edges of the room, was his own scent. The golden, distressed honey of an unsuppressed omega. He dropped his keys on the counter and stripped off Augustus's oversized t-shirt, throwing it directly into the trash can. He walked into the bathroom, turned the shower on as hot as he could stand it, and scrubbed his skin until it was raw and pink. It didn't work. When he stepped out and toweled off, the mirror was fogged, but the reality was perfectly clear. He was a beacon. He dressed in heavy sweatpants and a thick hoodie, pulling the hood up as if the cotton could somehow shield his scent gland. He walked to the small kitchenette, poured a glass of tap water, and sat at the battered formica table. Hours passed. The sun set, plunging the apartment into shadows. Declan didn't turn on the lights. He just sat there, listening. The psychic link had changed. It was no longer a forced intrusion of Augustus's feral instincts. With Declan actively participating in the connection, it felt like a heavy, invisible cable stretched taut across the city, humming with low-frequency tension. He could feel Augustus's environment. He felt the shift from the quiet of the penthouse to the sterile, high-altitude pressure of the corporate tower. He felt the precise moment Augustus drank a glass of scotch, a sudden, sharp burn in the back of his own throat, followed by a dull, spreading warmth. He hasn't eaten. The fridge in his apartment is empty, just half a carton of milk and a jar of mustard. I should send food. No. He told me to stay away. Declan rested his forehead against the cold formica of the table. He was exhausted, but sleep was impossible. The distance between them was supposed to bring relief, but it felt like a phantom limb. A physical ache throbbed in his chest, a deep biological yearning that terrified him. His omega biology, finally awake after a decade of chemical sleep, didn't care about societal norms or the fact that Augustus was his brother. It only knew that its alpha was miles away, and the separation was unnatural. Send the food, Declan thought, projecting it with a weary sigh. The response was instantaneous, a flare of pure, blinding relief from the other side of the city. Thai. From the place on 4th. The green curry. Fine, Declan replied. But don't send your driver. Just use a delivery app. And Augustus? Yes. The mental voice was painfully eager. Stop looking at the GPS tracker you put on my truck. I know you're staring at it. Across the city, Declan felt the distinct sensation of a laptop being snapped shut. I wasn't staring, Augustus lied. Declan managed a weak, humorless laugh in the dark of his kitchen. They were establishing a new baseline, a terrifying, codependent tightrope walk. They were apart, but they were more entangled than they had ever been. There were no secrets left. Every spike of anxiety, every flash of hunger, every dark, possessive urge that crossed Augustus's mind, Declan felt it. And increasingly he realized Augustus felt his. 40 minutes later, a knock at the door signaled the arrival of the food. Declan ate in silence, the spice of the curry warming his stomach. As he finished, a quiet, hesitant thought brushed against his consciousness. Is it good? Declan swallowed, looking out the window at the distant, glittering skyline. Yeah, it's good. Go to sleep, Dec. I'll keep the noise down. And true to his word, the roaring engine of Augustus's mind dimmed to a low, protective hum. Declan finally closed his eyes, his unsuppressed body aching for a warmth he refused to let himself have. 3 weeks later, the tightrope snapped. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Declan was in his workshop, carefully applying a layer of tung oil to a restored mid-century side table. The routine of the physical labor usually helped ground him, keeping his mind tethered to the smell of wood and the texture of the grain, rather than the constant psychic feed of his brother's corporate empire. They had managed a strained equilibrium. Augustus stayed in his tower. Declan stayed in his shop. They communicated entirely through the bond, mostly silent check-ins, flashes of emotion, or brief logistical thoughts. But over the last 48 hours, the hum in Declan's head had turned vicious. Augustus's company was negotiating a hostile takeover of a rival commercial real estate firm. The stress was normal for a CEO, but Augustus was an alpha operating entirely without an anchor. He was denying his wolf the one thing it had fixated on, Declan, and the deprivation was turning him feral. Declan paused, the rag hovering over the wood. A sudden, sharp spike of adrenaline hit him so hard his vision briefly whited out. It wasn't his own. Incompetent. Parasites. I'll ruin him. I'll snap his jaw. The aggression rolling through the bond was thick and suffocating. Declan dropped the rag and gripped the edge of the workbench, gasping for air. The physical symptoms of Augustus's rage were translating directly into Declan's nervous system. His heart hammered violently against his ribs. He closed his eyes and pushed his consciousness into the link. Augustus. Pull back. He's lying to my face. Augustus's mental voice was a distorted snarl. Thomas thinks he can hide the debt restructuring. He's sitting across from me, smiling, and he smells like cheap arrogance. I'm going to rip his throat out. Declan's eyes snapped open. The violence wasn't metaphorical. Declan could feel the exact tension in Augustus's muscles. He was preparing to lunge across a boardroom table. An alpha losing control in a corporate setting, especially one as high-profile as Augustus, would be catastrophic. It meant police, scandal, and forced psychiatric suppression. Augustus, look at me, Declan projected, pouring all of his focus into the command. Look at me, not him. Can't. Blood in my eyes. Need to bite. Shit, Declan swore aloud. He ripped off his denim apron, grabbed his keys, and bolted for the door. He didn't bother with the truck. The subway would be faster during the midday rush. He ran the 3 blocks to the station, his chest burning. As he rode the train toward the financial district, the psychic feed grew increasingly chaotic. Declan was no longer just hearing thoughts. He was getting flashes of visual input. The polished mahogany of the boardroom table, the sweating, pale face of a man in a navy suit. Thomas. The collective, terrified silence of the other executives in the room, suffocating under the crushing weight of Augustus's leaking pheromones. Mine, my company, my territory, threat, eliminate. Augustus's wolf was fully at the surface. Declan sprinted out of the subway station and through the revolving glass doors of the corporate headquarters. He bypassed the security desk entirely. The guards, recognizing the CEO's identical twin, didn't dare stop him, especially not when Declan's own unsuppressed omega scent was currently spiking with pure, terrified distress. He hit the elevator button for the 60th floor. The ride up was agonizing. He's shaking. Thomas is shaking. Pray. Snap the neck. Clean the den. No! Declan screamed into the bond. The force of his psychic projection was so intense, the elevator lights actually flickered. Augustus, stop! I'm here! I'm coming! The elevator chimed, the doors sliding open to the executive floor. It was a war zone of pheromones. The air was so thick with Augustus's aggressive, ozone-heavy scent that the beta secretaries were huddled near the restrooms, physically ill. 2 junior alphas were pressed against the wall, their heads bowed in involuntary submission. Declan didn't hesitate. He strode down the hallway and shoved the heavy double doors of the boardroom open. The scene was frozen. Thomas was backed into the floor-to-ceiling window, his hands raised, his face devoid of color. Augustus was standing over him. Augustus's jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled up, and his hands were curled into fists, so tight his knuckles were bone white. His eyes were entirely black. The moment the doors opened, the dynamic in the room shattered. Augustus's head snapped toward the sound. The feral, murderous intent in his eyes collided with the sight of Declan standing in the doorway, chest heaving, his golden, honey-sweet scent instantly cutting through the heavy ozone. "Get out!" Declan said, his voice quiet but echoing in the silence. He wasn't talking to Augustus. The other board members didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled for the exit, slipping past Declan like frightened mice. Thomas practically crawled along the wall to reach the door, bolting down the hallway the second he was clear. Within 10 seconds, the boardroom was empty, save for the 2 of them. Augustus didn't move. He stood perfectly still, his broad chest rising and falling heavily. The wolf was entirely in control, its dark, blown-out eyes locked onto Declan. "You came. You left the nest. You came to my territory." The thought was pure instinct, dripping with a terrifying mix of possessiveness and reverence. Declan let the heavy wooden doors swing shut behind him, the latch clicking into place. He locked it. He stepped into the room, abandoning the safety of the hallway. He wasn't wearing his chemical armor anymore. He was entirely exposed, relying purely on the bond. "You're losing your mind, Augustus," Declan said softly, taking a step forward. Augustus took a mirroring step toward him. "You're not wearing blockers. I can smell you from across the room. You smell like rain, like honey, like mine." "You almost killed a man over a debt dispute," Declan continued, ignoring the intrusive thought, forcing himself to take another step. "You're slipping. Your control is gone." I don't need control. I need you. Augustus moved. It was a blur of motion. He crossed the 20 feet between them in an instant, but he didn't attack. Instead, his knees hit the thick carpet right in front of Declan. Declan froze, staring down at his brother. Augustus wrapped his arms heavily around Declan's waist, burying his face directly into Declan's stomach. The Alpha's massive frame was trembling violently. It wasn't the tremor of rage anymore. It was the catastrophic crash of an apex predator realizing it was starving to death. "I can't do it," Augustus choked out, the spoken words raw and broken. "The quiet, the distance. I sit in this office and I hear you breathing across the city, but I can't touch you. It's tearing my head apart." Declan looked down at the dark hair of his twin. His hands hovered in the air for a long moment, his own instincts warring with his logic. He was supposed to push Augustus away. He was supposed to maintain the boundary. But the pain radiating through the psychic link was unbearable. It was a deep, agonizing, bleeding wound in Augustus's mind. Slowly, inevitably, Declan lowered his hands. His fingers buried themselves in Augustus's hair. The moment he made contact, a sound tore from Augustus's throat, a low, desperate whine that belonged entirely to the wolf. Augustus's grip on Declan's waist tightened to the point of bruising, pulling Declan closer, dragging him down. Declan sank to his knees on the boardroom floor, matching Augustus's level. He wrapped his arms around Augustus's broad shoulders, pulling the Alpha's head onto his chest, right over his heart. "I've got you," Declan thought softly, wrapping his own soothing Omega presence around the jagged, bleeding edges of Augustus's mind. "I'm right here. Just breathe." And in the wreckage of the corporate boardroom, the CEO finally stopped fighting, completely surrendering to the one person who could hear his silence. They stayed on the floor for a long time, the heavy, aggressive ozone scent in the room slowly neutralized, bleeding out and being replaced by the deep, rich smell of rain hitting hot granite, mingling perfectly with Declan's sweet honey and pine. Through the bond, the chaotic static of Augustus's mind settled into a profound, exhausted stillness. For the first time in weeks, there were no intrusive thoughts of violence, no frantic tracking, no desperate urges. There was only a heavy, anchors-dropped sense of arrival. Declan kept his hand buried in Augustus's hair, gently scratching against the scalp. It was a deeply intimate, biological gesture of comfort. He felt Augustus's breathing slow, the erratic pounding of the Alpha's heart steadying against Declan's ribs. When Augustus finally pulled back, he didn't look away. His eyes were no longer the blown-out black of a feral wolf. They were Augustus's eyes again, sharp, intelligent, and deeply tired. "I terrified you," Augustus said quietly, his voice raspy. "You almost ruined your own life," Declan corrected, keeping his tone firm. He didn't pull back from Augustus's proximity. "If you had bitten Thomas, you'd be in a cell right now." "I didn't care about Thomas. I just needed to tear down anything standing in my way until I got to you," Declan sighed, feeling the truth of the thought resonate through the link. "That's exactly the problem, Augustus. You think you're protecting me, but you're a loose cannon. You can't operate like this. We can't operate like this." Augustus shifted, sitting back on his heels, his hands still resting lightly on Declan's waist. "Then tell me how we operate. Because I'm telling you, Declan, I can't do the distance. My biology is rejecting it. My mind is rejecting it." Declan looked around the opulent boardroom, the spilled water pitcher, the overturned chair, the sheer amount of wealth and power Augustus commanded, all of it instantly rendered useless by a genetic fluke. "We stop fighting it," Declan said. The words tasted heavy, final. Augustus's hands twitched. Stop fighting. You mean? I mean, I'm done taking the pills, Declan said, meeting Augustus's gaze directly. I'm done hiding in my shop, and I'm done pretending that we are two separate people. Augustus inhaled sharply. A wave of awe, heavily laced with a sudden, overwhelming hope, rushed through the psychic connection. You're coming back to the penthouse. You'll stay with me. No, Declan snapped, projecting a sharp spike of authority into the bond to halt Augustus's spiraling possessiveness. Listen to me. I am not moving into a glass cage, and I am not your pet. If we do this, we do it my way. Augustus blinked, surprised by the commanding tone. The alpha instinct in his chest ruffled, but he forced it down. Your way? Yes, Declan said, reaching up and gripping the lapels of Augustus's ruined shirt. He pulled Augustus an inch closer, asserting his own space. You're the dominant alpha to the rest of the world, but in here, Declan tapped his own temple. In the bond, you yield to me. Augustus stared at him, the request utterly alien to his nature. Yield? An alpha doesn't yield. This one does, Declan projected fiercely. You yield, Augustus. When I tell you to back off, you back off. When I tell you to stop tracking me, you stop. When your wolf gets too loud, you let me handle it. I am your anchor. You don't control the anchor. The anchor controls you. Silence stretched between them. It was a profound shift in their dynamic. For years, Augustus had been the protector, the warden, the silent obsessively watching from the shadows. Declan was demanding the keys to his own cage, and simultaneously taking the leash to Augustus's wolf. Augustus looked at Declan's face. He saw the strength there, the quiet, stubborn resilience of the craftsman who had endured years of chemical poison just to survive. He saw the unsuppressed omega radiating a golden, grounding heat. You would take that on? Augustus's thought was quiet, hesitant. You would carry my weight? Declan's grip on the shirt softened. He smoothed the fabric down, his thumb brushing against Augustus's collarbone. I've been carrying it for 10 years, Augustus. I just never had a say in how we walked. Augustus closed his eyes. The last remaining wall inside his mind, the wall built of guilt, of shame for his forbidden desires, of the desperate need to control everything around him, crumbled entirely. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against Declan's. I yield, Augustus whispered aloud. The moment the words left his lips, the psychic link snapped into perfect, terrifying clarity. The static vanished. The friction was gone. Instead of a one-way mirror or a strained cable, it became an open door. Two minds, identically forged, finally slotting together without resistance. Declan felt a rush of Augustus's absolute devotion, completely stripped of its violent, possessive edge. It was pure, grounding, and overwhelmingly warm. In return, Declan let his own walls drop, flooding the bond with his deep, unshakable acceptance. Augustus tilted his head, his nose brushing against the sensitive skin of Declan's neck, right over the pulsing scent gland. He didn't bite. He didn't even open his mouth. He simply inhaled, breathing Declan in deeply, taking the soothing pheromones straight to his brain. You smell like home, Augustus murmured against the skin. I know, Declan replied softly, resting his cheek against Augustus's hair. They were twins. They were an alpha and an omega. They were a CEO and a carpenter. They were broken, messy, and bound by a taboo biology that the world would never understand. But sitting on the floor of the boardroom, high above the city, the noise in the blood finally went quiet. And that brings us to the thrilling, emotional conclusion of The Noise in the Blood. Declan and Augustus have finally stopped fighting their nature and established a dangerous, beautiful new equilibrium. Can an alpha truly yield to an omega anchor? It seems these twins are about to find out. If you loved this deep dive into psychic bonds and omegaverse drama, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe so you never miss another intense romance. Drop a comment below. Did Declan make the right choice by taking the leash? See you in the next video.